We are live on YouTube and LinkedIn. Our topic today is energy intermittency. With us again, and with a great pleasure, Professor Cleveland Jones.
Great
We
to be
can
with you again, Kavaya.
thank you. It's always a pleasure. Professor, before we go to your slides and your comments, I would like to share a unique slide. Is a conceptual slide to show um, a concern that I have about renewable energy. You can see in green the renewable supply, the energy supply by wind and solar, for instance.
Yeah,
And in blue, we can see the electricity demand. Uh, in two situations, we have problems with renewable. At night, with the sun, and cloudy days for solar.
yeah,
And for wind, low wind or no wind,
yes,
this is a problem. And how people compensate these two situations with batteries, large batteries, not small. Every time it's very big, and with dispatchable energy, nuclear, coal, etc. My point is that we do not consider these costs normally in the renewable costs. They do not make explicit these costs when we
yeah,
talk about renewable costs. This is my point, and if you can talk about
yeah.
this during your
Yeah,
presentation.
this is very good conceptual slide, but I think there's still one other thing that we are beginning to see a lot, and that is curtailments. Curtailments is when you have a lot of solar, a lot of wind, and you just can't use enough of it either to charge batteries or whatever, and you actually are restricted from bumping it into the grid because of grid limitations.
Yeah.
What happens? You have curtailment. Basically, wasted energy, all of this investment in generating capacity, and the thing is churning or the panels are there receiving light and nothing happens.
Yeah.
This is really tragic. It's a
It's a
planning
concern.
mistake, and in many cases, it is a result of uh, wrong planning where these renewable energies are provided incentives, they're put in place even before the grid can accommodate them. That
And,
is a big problem.
and misconcept, misunderstanding about the total cost. This is a point that I'm
Yeah,
looking for all the time.
yeah. This is along the lines of private investors, of course, they build these systems and so on, and then they expect the grid to be there. Well, the grid isn't there oftentimes, and someone else has to invest in
Yeah.
that, either the government, entities, agencies, or another private company that is maybe in charge of the transmission. That, unless you have very good conversation between those two elements, things don't work. So it's important. I wanted to just share these
Sure.
slides with you here.
Before you start, only to say that we have Paula Kerber with us today again.
Oh, nice to have you, Paul.
Welcome, Paula. Welcome.
Good. Um, Let me show this. This is basically what we were saying. Energy intermittency is a problem, especially for renewables and for this so-called electrification will solve everything. No, electrification brings intermittency as a problem. So that has to be considered. And then it also is important to be able to distinguish the kinds of intermittency that we're talking about. As you mentioned, sure, if you have cloudy period during the day, you can have a very short period of intermittency, sometimes just seconds, sometimes minutes, sometimes the whole day.
All day.
Um,
Yeah.
and with wind energy, a lot of the wind farms are subject to intermittency that can last several days. A non-windy spell of up to a week. In that has a component that is more dependent on geography, depending on where you site these wind farms. We had a discussion on your YouTube a while back where someone was saying in the U.S., for example, wind energy has a very low usage factor, down into the 20s and 30%. In Brazil, unlike that, we have up to 50 and 60, in some cases 70%, meaning very steady winds or low periods, or very short periods without wind, as opposed to long dry spells. That helps in terms of the long duration intermittency, but you still have the short duration intermittency. That happens. And then you have long intermittency. For example, even hydroelectric plants, they don't run 100% of the time. If you have a dry season, you have intermittency. It just happens to be seasonal or an annual basis. We've had those problems here in Brazil. African countries are having some of those problems. That intermittency is going to be very difficult to overcome, other than with large alternative energy sources that are based.
This specific points more related to hydro.
Yeah, hydro, because it is a large source of concentrated power usually, and when you have a dry season, that large power, which is usually base power, if it goes away, boy, that's going to be very difficult to substitute. In many countries, the U.S., here in Brazil, gas fired thermal generation works because you can fire up, pretty quickly, and for long periods, even months of a dry season, these power plants can take up the slack. They do require maintenance, so that isn't a perfect solution. It's a solution because you can't go without the energy, but it's not an ideal situation. And of course, you still have the same problem of investing in an energy source that happens not to produce sometimes. In China, in particular, that is a big problem. The Three Gorge project, which is much larger than the next largest one in Itaipu, Brazil, and Paraguay. Even though it's much larger, it generates less electricity because of the seasonal aspects and so on. So that is a large, expensive project which just can't fully provide all of the power
But
that.
but but do they consider this cost of the backup energy in the system, in the decisions, or is
I would.
all things are subsidies?
Yeah, yeah.
Subsidies supporting these
In
people.
China, I think they knew that the Three Gorge system was going to work that way. It didn't have a giant reservoir. It takes a while to fill, and then the rainy seasons and the dry seasons are extreme. So they probably were aware of that, and they probably did have alternative arrangements, because the grid interconnection in China is actually pretty good, which is one of the tactics to deal with intermittency. I would say that in many countries, that is not considered in the cost of a
Yeah,
renewable energy project. And that is a problem, because you can't just shift that cost somewhere else and expect society, the government, or another company to pick it up.
exactly.
So more and more, I think that we're learning, when licensing and so on is going on, that there has to be some conversation among more than just the party involved in the energy project, so that it
Yeah,
can be interconnected, so that these alternative investments have to be made in strengthening the grid or
okay.
providing alternative energy.
Mhm, mhm.
But that is a reality, because in all cases, intermittent sources, certainly the renewables, wind and solar, are going up like crazy. So there is no question that we are increasing intermittency as a portion of the problem of the overall grid. As higher percentages of renewable energy are provided, you get those problems. And you also get the problem of curtailment, which is really an inefficient way of providing energy to the economy, because you provided an investment that is paid for, but isn't generating a source of revenue for
Mhm.
at least some part of the time.
Okay.
But you can have this short term intermittency, which if it's relatively short, seconds, minutes, hours, you may be able to provide storage to overcome that. And in many projects, that is feasible. But if you're talking large projects, it's going to be very difficult because intermittency means that you might have zero generation. And if you have a 1 gigawatt project and you have zero generation, you have to have 1 gigawatt of uh,
Contingency.
power available. And even if it's for a short duration, that means a significant storage capacity. Um, Storage capacity is funny because you can have a given storage capacity and you can use it all up in a short period of time if it's a short period of intermittency, or you can use it up over a longer period of time if you have a longer period of intermittency and less demand. But you can't have it both ways because the overall capacity of storage is what determines the cost, basically. So you can't have storage, unlimited storage and storage to make up all of your production because that would be prohibitively expensive. So that's a concern. And then we have to consider that intermittency can actually not only provide shortage of electricity, it can provide grid breakdown. We had a situation in Brazil last year, so when intermittent sources up in the Northeast, a lot of wind generation and so on, actually caused the grid to fail because it's very difficult to compensate where production is going and demand is demanding power. So that is a concern, and it requires investment, not just in alternative power or storage, but in grid strengthening, grid robustness, and that is expensive. It means laying more cables and so on. So the focus is generally on mitigating intermittency because you can't do away with it, right? So I think we spoke a while back about solutions for intermittency in terms of storage. We had a lot of new technologies beginning to get traction. They're already beyond the pilot stage, where you have not just 1,000 tons, for example, storage capacity in sand, but you can have 100,000 tons. Now you're beginning to get to the point where you are able to have megawatts, 100 megawatt capacities, and 10 gigawatt hours of storage. That is substantial. It's still not cheap, but it's feasible, and in some cases it's necessary because you have to have that backup. People talk about hydrogen as a storage means because you can store it underground and then you can generate electricity from hydrogen. When you're not using hydrogen, you can go back and hydrolyze water with hydrolyzers and you produce the
But
hydrogen again.
but
Very
professor,
wasteful.
it's not applicable everywhere and every
No,
time.
not
So it's
applicable
very
everywhere.
specific situations.
Yeah, the round trip. I mean, when you look at these things, it's so inefficient. The round trip of producing the energy and storing it, and then taking it from storage and producing it to overcome a shortfall is tremendous. Sometimes 70% or more energy wasted. So overcoming intermittency with large scale storage capacity is very complex. The best large scale storage capacity is pumped hydro, but that is only applicable in some cases and in some hydro projects, and maybe not the largest ones. China has giant ones and building more all the time. That is almost the most efficient, but very expensive again, right? It's
But
just like building.
all these options are theoretical yet. Are they not
No,
feasible in terms of commercially
the hydrogen,
applicable?
yes, theoretical, but the pumped storage, water storage up, it generates water when you don't need it. You pump the water back up. China has gigawatts and gigawatts of pumped storage hydro capacity. Um,
But my point is that the total cost of these alternatives are huge, are something
well,
that we are not taking
eh,
in consideration.
Yeah, that is a problem, no question. There are instances where it can make more sense than in others. So you can say, yes, the extreme cases are certainly, outlandish, and we have to even go back and say, did this project, renewable energy project, make sense when you need so much storage to compensate for intermittency? Maybe if we do that kind of thinking, a lot of those projects may just not go ahead. And on the other hand, some of the technology with pump storage is so efficient and inexpensive because the installation is basically the same to pump and to generate, that you don't have duplication in investment of another system. You basically use a system, but you have to have the right conditions. China has a lot of mountains that you can make
Yeah,
reservoirs up in the mountains. You can't do that everywhere, So there is
yeah,
very limited applicability in regional
yeah.
regions
That's the
of the
point.
world. Yeah.
Mhm.
There are, of course, I mentioned this because I think this is a one type of storage that is becoming very inexpensive, and it can be scaled up. Scaled up because generally batteries, the expensive part gets bigger, and then the cost gets bigger. In flow batteries, the expensive part is just the middle, the part that generates, and the storage is just two tanks with electrolytes that you can basically make as big as you want. So if you want a storage system with 100,000 liters, you can do that. 100,000 cubic meters, you could theoretically do that.
Wow,
That is the
so big.
future, very big. That is the future for large wind farms and large solar installations. There is no question that this is the storage type system that may be employed in the future. There are several, not just pilot plants. They're small units, again in the 100 megawatt range, not so small units operating. So this is indeed practical. And when you get this point, then the learning curve makes it a little bit easier. And we can see that in the next couple of years, this will be a technology that will very likely over, pass Elon Musk's power walls and that kind of stuff, which is,
Mhm,
conventional storage.
mhm.
Well, beyond this, um, we have to think about the peakers, like you mentioned. LNG is perfect for many countries that don't have resources of natural gas and so on. They can generate renewable energy. A lot of African countries, Latin American countries, Southeast Asian countries. I'm speaking generally the southern hemisphere, but it's very important to have natural gas generation, which is relatively inexpensive as long as you can have the gas. And with LNG and cheap LNG nowadays, given prices from the US, you can actually achieve much of the intermittency problem can go away as long as you can predict a little bit. Because even a gas generating plant goes on stream pretty quickly, but it's not instantaneous. So you do have a little problem there. But this is a big thing. And overall, many countries are increasing their use of natural gas peakers, wind and solar connected to the grid, and the grid is connected to peakers generating with natural gas. And the natural gas supply is by far the fastest growing segment. So this is an important point. We can mitigate a lot of the problem intermittency, the major alternative energy and renewable energy projects that make sense, but they have intermittency problems. If you can put in natural gas generation, that cost can be assimilated much easier because it's not so expensive as putting in battery systems and so on. Problem is, if you have idle times that are very large, then it begins to get a little bit expensive, right?
In Brazil, for hydro problems, we use natural gas to compensate to make
Yeah,
it
and
continuous. Is
very
it correct?
effectively
Yeah.
because the drought season that Brazil just went through was historic, and Brazil did not have the curtailments in power generation that would have been the case if we didn't have these natural gas plants and they were
It's
running
for
at full steam.
it's for hydro and for wind and solar intermittency. What do you use in Brazil? You know?
Well, no, they're connected to the grid, and when they're not
Ah,
producing,
okay,
it's just we
okay,
don't have many wind and solar farms that are fully connected with storage systems. That is an
hmm,
expensive proposition for those
perfect.
generating systems. So maybe in the Middle East, some of these areas that it's essential to have that generation, they can afford to have the ancillary storage put in, but
Okay,
that is expensive. So I think that is still waiting for example, larger flow batteries, larger storage systems of some other sort, maybe even uh, uh, not LNG supplies, but LNG in caverns where you can store the natural gas. You can also import LNG, but you can also
yeah,
use
it's more
natural gas in
complicated
caverns.
with because the pressure and temperature. LNG is not simple.
Exactly. But if you do have gas and you can pump it in
Yeah,
underground storage, that makes it easier, of course.
hmm, perfect.
Um, and then geothermal, we talked about this a while back. Geothermal is picking up fast. This is one area where I think the U.S. Department of Energy is actually providing reasonable incentives for new technology because they're focusing on next generation of geothermal, which we discussed is geothermal that looks at high temperature underground, very steady temperature, should not be very expensive. There are some installations in operation. We need to have more. And if they work, the concept is that they're scalable because if you can have one work, you can just have 1,000 of them. They're just the same thing, cookie cutter, except that you have to find geological appropriate regions to have that, and
But
that is
it's
base
still
power.
it's still in the research phase. We do not have
No,
commercial
no,
solutions.
there are several in the U.S. We now have several, three that I'm aware of, installations that are beyond pilot. And that is important because they're operating and maybe they should operate for longer time to see what happens, but they're operating and they're economical at this stage. So the question is if we feel confident enough to invest in that as a base power generation, then we can overcome some of the intermittency. All of these are mitigation strategies or tactics, actually, because they can't mitigate 100% of the intermittency. But if you have more base power, you reduce the need for some
It's a
of
kind of
the
attenuation.
attenuation. That's the point. So, but it's important because if it can scale up fast, that could make intermittency less of a problem over a country, over an economy. And then we discuss hydrogen. I agree with you. Hydrogen is wonderful in the future, but it's like nuclear energy or fusion. It's always in the future. Maybe we're making some inroads, and
It's, it's used like a battery. Hydrogen's a fluid battery, like this.
you can say that because as long as you can produce hydrogen, produce it from underground, for example, reasonably, and not by electrolysis, which is really a stupid system. If
Costly.
Yeah, very ineffective. If you can produce natural hydrogen, whether it's naturally occurring or whether you can stimulate its production from depleted oil and gas reservoirs, for example, then you have uh, clean hydrogen. You have hydrogen and you can burn it on site for power generation. But again, you have to be in the right place geologically, even though it looks like there would be more places in the world where this could work out, because now we're beginning to look for white hydrogen, natural hydrogen accumulations. And in countries like France, which is highly dependent on nuclear energy, uh, which is not intermittent, now they have the option of having another source because
Mhm.
France is actually where some of the largest white hydrogen, naturally occurring hydrogen deposits have recently been
But
identified.
but the costs to produce hydrogen to accumulate energy for a contingency plan
No,
is much
not
higher
worthwhile
than
accumulating. Not
okay.
worthwhile. It's that is the problem. It's expensive when you handle it. If you just produce it and burn it, perfect. You know that you're producing it and sending it right to the gas plant,
Consumption
which is
point.
burning hydrogen. But if you plan to store it and so on, then you get to that high inefficiency, and it makes it all very difficult.
With special
But
materials,
special
special
materials, even
not
storage
viable.
pressures, and very very complicated. So the idea is if you can produce hydrogen and use it
Goes
on site,
goes to consumption.
then that could help. And even in electrification, for example, if you use it to produce electricity, that's good. Or you can use it directly, for example, in steel production or cement and so on. That
Or
is an alternative.
heavy trucks in Germany, for instance, for example.
China is thinking of that. Hydrogen on a retail basis, I'm not convinced that we're going to be there. It's
Exactly.
very expensive to deal with it effectively. And hydrogen burns with an invisible flame. That is a high risk, and you can have difficult time overcoming some of those problems. But I tell you, one of the things that we read a lot about is, for example, Tesla implementing these large scale energy storage systems in Australia, Saudi Arabia, wherever, with basically,
But how big is this kilometers of
yes,
battery?
and very expensive. And, this is just scaling up basically power walls. You have hundreds of them. And
Wow.
this is a very inefficient way of providing large scale because these are not uh, efficient storage units when you are talking about gigawatts. They may
My
be very efficient for a
my
home.
yeah, but my
Yeah.
opinion, the money that make support for these investments are money from subsidies, not the private investment, because there
Yeah,
is no return.
that's the problem. They said they want a storage system in place. Sure, the one that they can get nowadays is this, and it's terribly expensive. And one power wall is something like 15 or 18,000 dollars for 13 or 14 kilowatt hours. It's very expensive. So if you have 1,000 of them, yes, you have large capacity, but highly inefficient. So it's important to keep that in mind because the takeaways are key here. Energy intermittency is applicable for the renewables and for those who think electrification is a solution.
That's a good point. Before we go ahead, please, in terms of how predictable are energy electrification. So, can we use artificial intelligence to predict and to optimize this arrangement in terms of
Not only
energy
can you use it, they're using it, but how
they are
effective
using?
is it? Artificial intelligence can help, for example, in grid management, but it can help, but it can't solve a problem. It can make it less bad. It can help you delay the necessary investment in grid upgrades, for
Yeah.
example, but eventually you have the problem. The solution that artificial intelligence can bring is a solution which we could have thought of if we had thought of it. But
Requires energy, a lot of energy.
basically, the solution is storage and so on. So these are the mitigating tactics that people actually use. Storage from
Yeah.
very short term, even floating, rotating flywheels with low
Yeah.
friction that can cover intermittency for very short periods to short times of seconds, minutes, days. Then we go to weeks and seasonal. That's the necessary infrastructure, expensive, as you said, not always considered beforehand. I think nowadays it is being considered more often, luckily, because of the problems that occurred, and especially curtailments, which hurt the bottom line very much. And then, of course, peakers of all types. And we're even talking about very large scale peakers, uh,
yeah,
such as natural gas units and so on, that
yeah,
could provide significant, even countrywide uh, energy when a significant portion of
okay,
renewables is away.
okay,
Um, but the other tactic is implementing more sources without intermittency. And we discussed this before. Ultimately, I think we agree that nuclear is fantastic. It's still, giving us trouble because we're shortening the time frame to installation. The U.S. is leading the way finally in implementing.
yeah, but there are different solutions at this time. Small model reactions, and you have to,
Yes, I think those are actually further out even than just the nuclear renaissance, just bringing back old
yeah,
nuclear
they
plants.
are yeah,
There's hundreds of them shut down all over the world. If we
yeah,
just begin to bring them back at a fraction of the cost of building a new one, then all of a sudden we will
yeah.
have significant more nuclear power at the base, non-intermittent, while for a couple of years while we figure
High
out how to
density,
bring yeah. While we figure out how to overcome some of these problems with other
yeah,
solutions.
yeah,
But grid strengthening is essential, and that's expensive. We discussed a while back. Yes, we can have superconducting wires that can provide grid upgrades. We can provide new designs for the existing grids that can duplicate and triplicate the power they can carry. That helps. But if you need four times more, you still have to build something, right? So the mitigation only carries you so far. Beyond a certain point, you have to actually build new structure, and that's expensive. And long delays, environmental licensing, all that kind of thing. But strengthening grids and connecting grids is fantastic. China is way ahead on this. A giant country is basically connected from top to down to left to right, so east to west. Brazil is not connected. Obviously, the Amazon region is very difficult to do so, and that is one of the problems that Brazil has. Is has independent energy system, just like Texas had an independent energy system way back when the ice storm brought down the system. If you're not connected, it's very difficult for you to overcome
okay,
individual areas that have intermittency or problems. And we can see this is going to continue with the fast pace of wind and solar installations. This intermittency problem is just going to get bigger, even though we're coming up with new solutions, but it's going to get bigger. And mitigating intermittency will continue to be a challenge because we are adding to the energy demand. So as long as we have this system of very strong, I would even call them artificial incentives for certain renewables, we are going down a very dangerous path because a lot of these decisions are now made based on legislation and so on, not
yeah.
on economics.
And
And
some money
and
for friends. That's another part.
yeah, I've discussed this with you. The incentives that the government entities can provide and should provide should be for developing new technologies at
Perfect.
the science and
Research,
technology level.
yes. To
That
discover,
is
to
basic.
establish new situations, exactly.
Yes.
Not for
Just
commercial proposals.
once they're beyond, the lab points on, let the big guys, the big investors, the
Exactly.
venture capitalists invest
Risk
and take those things private.
risk investment, of course.
if
Yeah,
if
sure.
they're as good as they're made out to be, there will be success and they will make money,
Perfect.
and that's where the money
This
will be.
point is fantastic. So subsidies and incentives for research discoveries, but not for the commercial proposals.
Exactly. This is a problem all over the world. The countries are very anxious to pass laws, and legislators are anxious to do so. Oh, we should have this type of energy here, and we should have this type of backup.
And,
You
and
can't do that.
professor, we need more science and technology than conversations without knowledge. People talking every time about energy without knowing exactly what energy is. What's the difference
I think
between
there is a
fossil fuels
silver
and so on?
lining. Nowadays, as you know, for example, the Democratic Party in the U.S. has begun talking up nuclear again, whereas in the past it used to be that the Democrats were against nuclear.
Was
And
forbidden
when
for
you
them.
look at the facts, nuclear is safe, it's not intermittent, and safe technology, and people were just not paying attention. They loved coal,
That's
which
right.
was also cheap, but much more dangerous from the mining side and from the production side. So
Yeah,
now we have to go back to basics and see what makes sense. Certainly, nuclear does. Even
right.
biofuels might
Yeah,
make sense in certain cases. But for the next couple of years, we will have to continue intermittency mitigation because we're not going to deal with it
perfect.
any other way.
Yeah,
It's not going to go away.
that's right. That's fantastic. So, but the point, the main point of our conversation is separation of
Yes.
research, money, subsidies for
Yeah.
research, and the difference for commercial proposals. That's great. Thank you, Professor Cleveland Jones.
Great.
Great
It was
pleasure.
fun.
Bye bye.